There is a particular kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. You know the one, the kind that arrives mid-afternoon, not because your body is worn out, but because you have already processed more information before lunch than your grandparents encountered in a month. The emails, the notifications, the articles you opened, half-read, and left as 17 tabs you will never return to. The feeling, persistent and low-grade, that you are perpetually behind on something you cannot quite name. That is not a personal failing. That is the rational response of a biological system encountering a civilizational force it was never designed to withstand. And here is what matters. Artificial intelligence did not arrive because a group of engineers were ambitious. It arrived because that feeling, the one you carry every single day, had finally become a problem large enough to demand a solution at scale. Your exhaustion is not incidental to this story. It is the origin of it. Today we close the historical arc we have been building together, and we arrive at the world you actually inhabit. We are going to talk about the Internet, not as a piece of infrastructure, not as an abstraction, but as the specific, extraordinary, and slightly overwhelming event that shaped the texture of your daily life, and that created the precise raw material artificial intelligence was built to process. The flood did not come from nowhere. It came from a triumph. In March of 1989, a quiet, methodical British physicist at CERN submitted an internal proposal to his superiors. His name was Tim Berners-Lee, and the proposal was titled, with admirable restraint, Information Management, a Proposal. His manager wrote 3 words in the margin and returned it to him. Vague but exciting. The ambition was modest. Berners-Lee wanted a better system for physicists at CERN to share research documents with one another. A local problem, a human-scale solution. What followed was not. Within 5 years of that proposal, the early web had escaped the laboratory entirely. By the mid-1990s, ordinary people were navigating it through the first browsers, and the first earnest attempts to organize it were already underway. Directories with names like Archie, AltaVista, Yahoo. Human editors working at human pace, cataloging a thing that was growing faster than any human index could follow. This is the pattern we have traced across every era of information revolution. Gutenberg's press democratized knowledge, and the established order took decades to absorb the consequence. The web compressed that same pattern into years. The cost of distributing information to a global audience did not merely fall, it collapsed to zero. That was the tap, and once it was opened, no one could turn it off. By the late 1990s, the problem was already visible to anyone paying attention. The web was not merely large, it was becoming genuinely unmappable by human effort. The signal was drowning in the noise. The answer that emerged was, by any measure, a genuine act of intellectual elegance. 2 graduate students at Stanford, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, proposed that the value of a web page could be inferred from the behavior of other web pages. A page that many others linked to was likely more authoritative than one that none did. They called the mechanism PageRank, and it became the engine of Google. For the first time, machine logic was being applied at scale to the chaos of human-generated information. It worked, remarkably well. Searches that had taken minutes of careful navigation now resolved in a fraction of a second. And then something interesting happened. By making information retrieval frictionless, Google did not reduce the volume of information being produced. It accelerated it. If content could now be found, content was worth creating. The incentive structure drove an explosion of production that dwarfed anything that had come before. Every organization, every business, every individual with something to say was now a publisher. The tap that had already been opened was turned up further still. By some estimates, by the mid-2000s, the volume of digital information being created annually had exceeded the cumulative total of everything previously recorded in human history. Set aside the precision of that figure, the scale it gestures at is real. We had entered a genuinely unprecedented era of abundance. The problem was that the human brain had not been consulted on the matter. We evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in conditions of radical information scarcity. A typical human life, for the vast majority of our history as a species, involved a small community, a defined geography, a relatively stable set of social relationships, and a manageable volume of daily decisions. Our cognitive architecture was shaped by that environment. The mismatch between that architecture and the world the web created is not subtle. Consider what the modern professional now manages before 9 in the morning. An inbox that refills faster than it can be emptied. A newsfeed algorithmically calibrated to generate engagement through urgency. Decisions about sources, about credibility, about priority made dozens of times before the working day has properly begun. The compressed attention, the low-grade anxiety, the peculiar guilt of the unread article. This has a name in cognitive science. We call it information overload or cognitive load, the experience of a system operating beyond its processing capacity. And it is worth being direct about what that means. The symptoms you have been experiencing are the entirely predictable consequence of a mismatch between a biological system and the environment it now inhabits. It is not weakness. It is physics. The early critics of the printing press worried, genuinely, that cheap books would corrupt the minds of ordinary readers, that the sheer volume of available thought would overwhelm the capacity for discernment. The anxiety is historically recurring. The flood always feels, in the moment, like it might be the end of something. Humanity, however, has a consistent record on this front. We do not stop at the flood. We build the next thing. Here is what the flood left behind. Alongside the overwhelm, alongside the cognitive burden, alongside every frustration you have carried through 20 years of the modern web, the Internet created something that had never existed in the history of our species. An infinite, digitized, machine-readable library. The accumulated output of human knowledge, creative production, scientific inquiry, cultural expression, and documented experience, encoded in formats that a sufficiently powerful system could, in principle, read. The key word is sufficiently powerful, because the library existed long before the reader capable of processing it arrived. For years, the information sat there, vast and largely inaccessible in any meaningful sense. We could search it, piece by piece, manually, at human pace. We could not synthesize it. We could not cross-reference it at scale. We could not ask it a question and receive a genuinely considered answer drawn from across its full breadth. What was missing was not storage. We had solved storage. What was missing was processing power. Mathematical processing power of a magnitude that could actually stand in front of that infinite library and do something useful with what it found. That gap between the library and the processing engine capable of reading it is the exact space that artificial intelligence was built to occupy. The flood was not simply a crisis. The flood was the raw material. The very condition that made the solution necessary is the same condition that made the solution possible. This is where the story turns. The history of artificial intelligence is not solely the history of how we stored human knowledge. It is equally, and just as importantly, the history of how we built the mathematical engine powerful enough to read it. And that story does not begin in Silicon Valley. It does not begin in the age of software or the era of the Internet. It begins with an abacus. If you have found this series valuable, the most meaningful thing you can do is subscribe. It ensures the next chapter reaches you directly, and it tells us that this work is worth continuing. Once you have done that, there is a curated list of further reading in the description below, covering the history of the Internet, the cognitive science of information overload, and the mechanics of the attention economy, compiled specifically to complement what we have covered today. Every generation believes at some point that it has encountered the thing that finally breaks the pattern, that this time the scale is genuinely different, that this time the tool we have built has outrun our capacity to manage it. They are never entirely wrong about the scale. The printing press did fracture centuries of established order. The Industrial Revolution did displace entire categories of human labor. The digital age has genuinely altered the architecture of human attention in ways we are still measuring. But the species does not stop at the fracture. What we call a crisis of abundance is always, on longer inspection, an inheritance. The overwhelm of one era becomes the foundation of the next. The library that exhausted us is the same library that now, for the first time, has a reader capable of doing it justice. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to the journey ahead.